My name is Carl Mall. I'm the technical project advocate at Finos. Welcome to the first Open Source in Finance webinar. This is a member benefit available to our members to come take advantage and to produce and present a webinar of general interest to the Finos community. So please contact the Finos team if you yourselves would also like to host a webinar, as we're really excited for this today. Today's webinar is Cloud Native, Cost Conscious, No Compromise, Leveraging Open Source Databases in the Financial Industry, presented by the Percona team. And we are joined by Sergey Pronin, the Group Product Manager at Percona, and Lorusso, the Head of Community at Percona. And with that, handing it over to Lori and Sergey to get things started.
Thanks, Carl. Hey, everyone. Let's get started, Lori.
Let's do this thing. So as all presentations start, and gotta love our very long title. Good job to you, Carl, for getting it all out. Let's start with some introductions. Let's go. As you can tell, it is like looking in the mirror. So you know what it's like when you don't know your colleagues and you've never met them in person, and then they say, oh, you remind me of so-and-so, or I thought you'd be taller. Apparently to Sergey, I remind him of Teddy Swims. There you go. So
just a bit.
Lori, just a bit, just a little bit. It's like looking in the mirror, to be honest. So again, my name is Lori. I am a CNCF ambassador. I'm a CDF ambassador. I do things with OpenSSF. Really stoked to be here talking with the Finos crowd. Head of community at Percona. I've been here for about 6 months and just really vested in open source and helping people use it to their benefit. Now to you, Sergey, or should I say powder?
Oh, yeah, powder is good enough. So I'm not that pale, Lori, but yeah. So what I do at Percona, I'm a group product manager. My main interest is around our cloud native story, databases, Kubernetes, observability, and everything that surrounds open source technology in cloud native world. So today we're gonna talk to you about how open source technologies and cloud native in general can impact your costs and cloud story as a whole.
So just to give you an idea of what we're going to talk about today, here's our agenda. So we're going to have a little bit of an intro, go over the history of open source just a little bit, the role of open source in the financial services industry, and then I'm going to pass it over to Sergey, and he's going to talk about some cloud native things. Everest, we're going to go live. Everybody cross your fingers with the demo. And we're going to show you really how you can cut costs in the cloud. I know that might seem like something that you haven't heard about before. You think moving to the cloud is going to cost a lot of money, but we've got you covered. And then at the end, we'd love for you to give us some Q&A. I believe there's a Q&A box down below that Carl will be monitoring, or you can put it in the chat, and then we'll do that at the end. So really happy to be here, and let's get going. Let's talk open source. So let's go over a quick refresher. And just so you know, as you can tell, Sergey and I, while we might look identical, we have different styles. So my slides at the beginning will be a little bit different than his slides at the end. Moving on, let's talk about open source. Next slide. There we go. So the world before open source software, what was that like? As you can imagine with Mr. Burns, for all of you Simpson fans out there, innovation was slow and it was tightly controlled by a few people. Like, what I love is this quote that I got from our SVP of engineering saying that you were 100% reliant and constrained on the innovation that you employ, right? So how do you get around this? Well, you just start like trying to have people sign NDAs so they don't jump ship and go to different companies. What was else the problem before open source? There's a lack of transparency. You don't know what you're using. You're just using what they're giving you. So you have no visibility into how the sausage is made. You can't lift the hood up and look and see what kind of parts are building the software that you're consuming. You're just consuming it. And then why are we here today? We're talking about costs. So when you're using something that you don't really know what it is, but you know that you need it for your business, you can't really control it. What can they do for you? They can increase your licensing costs because they know that they've got you and that you know that your infrastructure is based on their software. So costs are going up. So where innovation is slow, costs are high. But that brings us to the next beautiful thing, and why we're all here today, is open source. right? So what does open source bring to the table? The number one thing open source brings to the table, I think, is innovation and collaboration. And it's all done in a vendor neutral way, right? So you've got tons of experts from companies all around the world that could, in fact, be your competitors working together to solve one problem. Now, what you do with that problem, if you fork the repo and go off in another direction, that's on you. But the great thing is that the problem is being solved by experts from all around the world that have similar issues that you have. What else does it bring? It brings quality and security. So you have multiple eyes looking at what you're doing. You're not just throwing it out into the ether and hoping that it works. You have people testing and all kinds of things, which is really cool. And then again, you have accessibility. Like when we talk about accessibility, I'm in North Carolina. Sergey's not. I don't know where Carl is in the world, but anybody can access a GitHub repo from anywhere. So it is completely like opening the door and leveling the playing field. One of the things that I think is really important in open source, and I don't think we talk about it enough because it's not the quote, and I hate using this word, the sexy thing, is standards and interoperability. So when we talk about standards, it's bodies that are enacted to make sure everybody is using the right type of framework. And this is the Finos webinar, and it behooves me to talk about Finos' standards, which is the Finos Common Cloud Controls project that's out there right now. So if you haven't checked it out, go to their website. It's the Finos CCC. And it's a standards project that is developing a unified set of cybersecurity, reliancy, and compliance controls. I'm reading this, as you can tell, for common services across the major cloud service providers. Even within Finos, they're trying to set standards of operations for cloud service providers to make sure that the open source that you're consuming is secure. It's giving you the reference architecture that you can use to make sure that you're moving forward in a secure manner. And then lastly, what does open source bring to the table? Now, we're talking economic impact. Like when we think economic impact you're building faster, right? So you're able to go to market faster. You're using cutting edge technology, and none of it, we'll say this very loosely, is costing you a thing. But we are also talking about the other side of economic impact. Has anybody heard of Red Hat? Right? Did Red Hat jump on the scene and show you how you can make money with open source? Yes. But I digress. That's a whole nother conversation because we're talking about saving money with open source. So how do we move forward? And specifically, how does the financial services industry move forward? So in 2023, the Finos ran the State of Open Source and Financial Services. And if you haven't checked out the report, I again suggest that you go to the site and download it. And there's a couple of things I wanted to really pick out of this. And 60% of respondents to the survey agree that open source is valuable to the financial services industry. And in that, 65% of those surveys said that they have more time allocated to spend on open source contributions. So they're not just consuming open source, they're contributing back. And again, working in that collaborative nature. And I think one of the things that's really great to see here is that 78% agree that their organizations are getting more value from open source compared to 2022. Now, that was in 2023. I can only imagine how the numbers have increased this year. One of the things, though, that and we go back to the Finos CCC that I think is really interesting, and again, this is probably another talk for another time, but 91% of the respondents are confident that the open source they're consuming is well maintained and up to date. Now that goes back exactly to why there are standards bodies and things like that within organizations to make sure that number, while it is believed, is also maybe held true. So then in 2024, we're very thankful that Finos did another report, and it takes us to another stage in the game for the financial services sector. So 88% of respondents say that they are using open source software, or say that using open source software improves the quality within their own organization. Again, they're benefiting off of the collaboration and innovation of others to make what they're doing better. That's awesome. 84% agree that it delivers business value. Why? Because they're saving time and money on productivity and efficiency because they're taking things that others have used and built and building off of them. And then again, what I think is so awesome to see is that the GitHub contributions, 26% has gone up since last year from financial institutions itself. So again, it's not just about consuming open source, it's giving back to open source. And what's a great way to give back to open source? Dollars. Next slide. So look at the companies that are currently putting money behind the innovation in open source and financial services industry. Now, there's some that you might just say, of course, Citibank, Goldman Sachs, Fidelity. But then look at the other ones, right? You've got Google on here. You've got Microsoft on here. You've got Percona on here, AWS. You have companies that in your mind may have nothing to do with the financial services industry in general, but they're working together to make sure the financial services industry can innovate, collaborate, and move things forward at a rapid pace. Next slide. So now let's talk about database. So we've talked about the power of open source. Financial industries are using open source, but we're talking about databases. We're a database company. And here are the top 10 most popular databases, thanks to the developer survey in 2024. And as you can see, out of the top 10, 5, Postgres, MySQL, SQLite, MariaDB, DynamoDB. I didn't include Elasticsearch. If you've been following, they were open source and they weren't. Now they are again. Again, that's for somebody else to talk about. But of the top 10, 5 are open source. And that is huge. That is something that we need to applaud. And next slide. Now that we've got databases, guess what? Now they're moving to the cloud. And according to Gartner's CloudShift research, they're transitioning to the cloud, but spending is going up. And why are we here today? We're here to talk about cost savings in the cloud. So as more people take their database on-prem and move into the cloud, costs are going up because has anybody seen bills from cloud infrastructure lately? Yeah, if you don't have a control on that, if you're not really monitoring what you're doing, they can skyrocket. We had something similar happen where someone used an account that we weren't monitoring. We're like, oh, that was a nice bill. It didn't get turned off after the experiment was done. Whoops. So I'm going to hand this over to Sergey to talk about how you can save costs, but that's what we want to see. It's not so much show me the money, it's show me the cost savings. Sergey, on you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to talk a bit longer about cloud native and stuff. So in my line of work, you can imagine I pronounce the word containers a lot. And when I talk about it and my wife overhears or kids or friends who are not in IT industry, I have such friends, they usually think that I'm doing some logistics or I'm doing some pirating because moving containers and so on. And when you Google the word container, the first thing is a C container. And I was preparing for this webinar and wanted to find some interesting facts about containers. And one of them is this, that out of 250 million containers transported in 2023, only 222 to 21 were lost in the sea, which is kind of interesting because it's extremely low number. I think you have higher chances to be struck by lightning or something than to lose your container. Of course, today I'm not going to talk about C containers. We're all about cloud native technologies. And here are some more numbers. So last year, Datadog were running a report where they were observing 2.4 billion containers. And that's quite interesting report because it shows different data, but what we're here for is for this huge number. And the last public statement that Netflix made about their infrastructure was in 2018, so 6 years ago, where they were claiming that they run or deploy 500,000 containers per day. And I would say today this number is 10x or even bigger. So just imagine 500,000 or 5 million containers per day deployed by Netflix. And Google should have much more. So why I'm talking about containers? because containers are actually the power behind cloud native technologies. Cloud native technologies is not just words. It's a collection, it's an ecosystem, it's a mindset. It is about you taking your monolithic applications, breaking them down into microservices using containers. All these microservices, they talk to each other through APIs, and you have immutable infrastructure, which means that you have a Docker container that is not changing in any way. You have service meshes that help you to secure the networking between these APIs and containers. And all this forms this cloud native ecosystem that is growing day by day. And also it's quite interesting that a lot of people think that cloud native is all about clouds, where in a nutshell, it's not. Cloud native is a huge ecosystem, and the beauty of it that you can run all these technologies on-prem, in the hybrid mode, in clouds, and so on. So this term was coined long before the clouds even appeared. So what's the benefit for the business? How it influences the business, the cloud native ecosystem? So the first obvious benefit is faster time to market. Now, instead of waiting days to deploy something in production, you can do it in seconds and minutes. And going back to Netflix, they praise that they are deploying daily thousands of times to production. So they run experiments, they learn, they iterate, they deploy again. If something fails, they just fix it quite fast. So rapid development is what is fueling this cloud native journey for a lot of businesses. Cost efficiency is another one. And today we're going to talk more about it. But the latest surveys, they claim that you can save up to 60% of your cloud bill or your infrastructure costs when you adopt cloud native technologies. Sometimes it's even up to 80%. Scalability and flexibility is quite interesting because, again, if you look back in time, you might have seen companies prepping for Black Fridays. They were buying new servers so that they can accommodate all the load that is coming in, so that the servers are not crashing, the customers can still click the button and buy something in the shop, and so on. With cloud native technologies, the scalability and flexibility are given, where all your workloads can scale fast and automatically or automagically. And you don't need to think about peak hours. This is all done. And enhanced customer experience. That actually is what is coming from all these other three things. If you can deploy fast enough, if you can cut your cost, and if you're flexible enough, all it impacts your customers and the experience they get when they're using your services or products. And the beauty of it is that you shorten the feedback loops. So once you ship something to production, you get feedback, you ask questions, you ship again, you iterate, and your feedback loops are much shorter than it was before in the monolithic era. So now let's go and discuss some fun stuff. So we're here to talk about databases and open source technologies. So I was criticized multiple times for this picture because for various reasons. But in a nutshell, the history here is that long time ago, it was mainframes. You had the room where you had a huge server and it was running a database. To access this database, you might have even needed a key or something. So it was not really easy. Then we got a bit smarter. We started using smaller servers, bare metal servers, and each server can now host a database, an application, and so on. So we're a bit more modular. Then we got into the era of virtual machines, VMs. It was late 90s, and all the applications started adopting it, except for databases is quite a conservative market, and DBAs are quite conservative. When they first saw virtual machines, they were afraid to move their databases there for various reasons: performance, security, or it's something unfamiliar, I don't know what's inside, and so on. But if you look at today, everything is running on VMs, right? Almost everything. And so now we're getting to containers. Containers are fun. The reason why containers appear, it's all about efficiency. So now I, as a developer, I don't need to ask anybody to give me the database. I don't need to think how to run this database on my computer or in production. I have a Docker image that I built myself, or it was provided to me by my colleagues, and I can run it anywhere the same way I do it in production. So for me as a developer, I now have my database right next to my application, and it just works. And I am sure that it's going to work the same way in production. And that is what is actually powering this speed of development and velocity and shortening the feedback loop. So containers are awesome, and you start simple. You have single database, and it's extremely easy. You have two containers, one for application, one for database. They talk to each other, they live happily, but definitely you need something more. And you start with production and development environments. You need dev to test something, to verify if your code is good enough, and so on. You may even automate. But now instead of two containers, you have at least four. And that actually escalates quite quickly, where now you have multiple applications, multiple Linux servers, and all these applications are sitting in their own containers. They need to talk to each other. You need to orchestrate. You need to make sure that you are reliable, that you have high availability in place, and yada, yada, yada. And now you have a huge zoo, and you need to do something with all these containers. Welcome Kubernetes, right? And before Kubernetes, or alongside with Kubernetes, there were other products like Docker Swarm and Mesos, and they were doing exactly the same thing that Kubernetes does, is orchestration of containers. So Kubernetes helps you to automate your day-to-day work if you have a lot of containers. Instead of doing it all manually or coming up with some hacky scripts, you can do it all with Kubernetes. And that removes a lot of toil from your developers, from your engineers, and especially today, it's a coin term, platform engineers. But the real beauty of Kubernetes, as I see it, it also comes in with the run anywhere approach. What it means is that the Kubernetes provides you with an obfuscation. So whenever you run it in the cloud, on premise, you don't need to change your application. You use the same set of APIs, you run a command, and automatically your application runs, whether it's the cloud, whether it's some data center or your own machine. It doesn't matter. It's still the same way of doing things. And that's the real beauty of Kubernetes, because you remove the vendor lock-in from the equation completely. Now you're free and you can run whenever you want. And as we are in Finos webinar today, we also want to make sure that we keep our costs down. So we're going to talk a bit more, but I want you to remember that with cloud native technology and with Kubernetes itself, you can keep the costs down, and you will. So databases in Kubernetes, that's the next level. So Kubernetes is 10 years old, right? It's not legacy technology, it's not new, but to be honest, 10 years ago, nobody thought about running databases in Kubernetes. It was taboo because it was created to run stateless applications only, and database should be living somewhere else. That was how it was designed originally. And today, after 10 years, almost 90% of organizations are already running Kubernetes or they are planning to adopt it, according to CNCF survey. But what is more interesting for us here is that 70% of organizations, they already run stateful applications in K8s. That means that looks like the original assumptions that were there 10 years ago do not work anymore. And we see it also within Percona that the adoption of database in Kubernetes is growing year over year, mostly because Kubernetes matures itself, storage matures, and various applications around that space are also maturing, and we're going to see how. But wait, Kubernetes is actually complex. So I was just telling you how it helps you to remove toil, but at the same time, I want to be honest here, and it's not a silver bullet. You need to understand that when you start using Kubernetes, you need to learn a lot of things. And if we look on the picture on the left, that shows just the minimal number of Kubernetes primitives that are used when you create your database cluster in Kubernetes. So there are pods, roles, services, stateful sets, deployments, all these primitives, you need to understand how they work with each other. But also for applications and databases, we also should not forget that there are other pieces for them. Like for databases, we need to configure them properly. We need to tune them. We need to make sure that they perform. We need to make sure that they are highly available. So all these pieces we need to keep in mind. And then we also need to think about maintenance and day two operations. So how do I upgrade my database if it runs in Kubernetes? It looks like with all this complexity, it's not that easy, because not only I need to learn all this Kubernetes primitives and building blocks, but also I need to remember how to do it for databases within this environment. Looks like we are adding more complexity into the picture. But wait, there is a solution, right? The world of Kubernetes is very complex. That is the reality. And especially when you start writing your databases there, when you start creating backups or scaling it, it's a painful process. And that's why a lot of people think that it's for stateless applications. But the solution here is actually what was created in, I think, 2018, so 6 years ago. An operator SDK was introduced. What operators are is basically a set of commands, a set of logic that you can deploy into the Kubernetes, and it will work in the form of declare and get. Instead of learning all the Kubernetes primitives and all the databases, bits and pieces, what you can do is just declare the end state that you want to get. So you state how many nodes do you need to have, what version, where to upload your backups and everything. So everything in the gray area here, you don't need to learn at all. You just declare it to Kubernetes and operator does the rest. It has all the logic. And then as a user, you get the endpoint you can connect to, similar to public clouds, but in Kubernetes with open source technologies, you get the same user experience. You just declare, you get it, and you start using it. But the beauty of it is also that with operators, you can get day two operations. You can tell it to back up your database. You can tell it to expose it. You can tell it to upgrade it. And you don't need to learn anything about database itself. Operators are going to take care of it for you. So you just declare it and you get the desired state, right? So instead of being this grim man, you're going to be that funny man when you run databases on Kubernetes with operators. Now to the fun part as well. In Percona, we decided that we need to take it one step further. Even with operators, even with all the automation they provide, there's still some learning curve. So you need to understand how to create all this huge fancy YAML manifests that declare the state of your database. You still need to know a bit of Kubernetes, especially if you want to troubleshoot your databases. And you still don't get the same user experience that you would expect to get from the clouds, right? And that's why we created an open source solution or open source product, Percona Everest. What it does is it provides you a web UI, an API that you as a regular user can interact with, and it hides all this Kubernetes complexity and operators complexity for you behind the scenes. So it's the usual experience that you get within public clouds where you click, you get the database, and you can start running your applications, you can start using it, your developers can start using it for free because it's open source. All you need to have is a Kubernetes cluster. I think I have a demo. Yep. I hope everything is going to work fine because we thought about recording the demo, but then I got lazy and I decided to go live with it. First, I want to show you, this is our documentation page. Again, just to reiterate, our Percona Everest is completely free. It's open source technology. You can install it and use it. We don't have any enterprise features hidden. Everything we develop is on GitHub. It's available, so feel free to use it. The way to install it is extremely simple. It's just one command. So you install Everest CTL, run it, and it's done. You don't need to do anything else. It will ask you some questions, which are simple, which namespace, which databases you want to have, and that's it. As a result, what you're going to get is this simple UI. So we support authentication and the integration with various OIDC providers. You can set it up. So if you are a huge enterprise and you want some role-based access control and so on, we also support that. But the reality is that it's quite simple to use. You can click create the database, you pick the technology that you want to use. Currently, we support MySQL, Mongo, and Postgres. As Lori was showing, these are the top 3 databases now in the world. And we also plan to add more databases. And as it is an open source tool, we also embrace commits from the community and from various developers who want to add their technologies into that. We're working on adding Valkey. For those of you who don't know, Valkey is an open source Redis fork. So we're all about open source. We also want to add ClickHouse at some point because there's also an operator for that, and it's quite easy to do. But anyhow, so you choose the technology you want to use, for example, MySQL, you choose the database version. Usually we support at least 5 latest versions, but if you want to have some older versions, we can add it as well. Choose storage class. Storage class is specific to Kubernetes, and it depends on the performance you want to get. You can have your own storage classes, you can have your own storage providers, so it depends on your environment. Once you choose the technology, you can pick how many nodes you want. You want to be, if it is a production cluster, you don't want to have just a single node, you want to have multiple, and you can choose resources, CPU, RAM, disk. You can customize it the way you want, but it depends again on your workloads and your desired state. The next one is quite simple as well, is you can define the schedule for backups. So obviously you want to, if it is a production database, you want to store backups somewhere. I already configured the storage. It's some GCS bucket. So what you need to do is just define what's the retention period. And I would take backups every hour and keep last 17. I don't know why, but that would work. You can have point-in-time recovery, which means that if you are again in production, you would want to lower down your recovery point objective. So if something goes south, if someone deletes the data or alters it, you can easily roll back, and without point-in-time recovery, it doesn't make sense to run production databases, so definitely go for it. and various other parameters. You can expose the database to the outside world. In the world of Kubernetes, it usually means that we're going to create a load balancer for you. You can configure and fine-tune your database. By default, we already tune the database. Our operators have this capability where we want to make sure that your databases perform in Kubernetes, and we know what are the best practices. So we already set some parameters there. But if you feel that you need some tuning, you can set your own parameters for sure. And you can enable monitoring. Right now, we are integrated with Percona monitoring and management, which is our tool, but you can also integrate it quite easily with Prometheus or any other open source technologies through sidecars. It's a bit hacky, but you can still do it. It's not very complex. And then you click create database, and the database is going to be created. It will take some time. Usually it's less than a couple of minutes, depending on the number of nodes, on your cluster capacity, and so on. Looking into databases, you can get a lot of details about the components. You can even troubleshoot what's going on. You can see, okay, what's going on with my fancy Postgres instance? Is it up? Is it down? What is going on with containers? We support logging as well. I think already somewhere here you can see logs, but I don't remember where, so I will not go there. And yada yada. Right now, again, Postgres, MySQL, Mongo, the top 3 open source databases today. And yeah, we are looking forward for your feedback. Lori, do you want to add anything on Everest that I'm missing?
No, I think that this was a great overview, except it would be good if we would appreciate, like Sergey said, for you to download and try it out and give us the feedback. And we also hope that you have questions for the Q&A at the end that can help us refine how we present and how we upload, how we accelerate our documentation to make sure that there's no questions. You can just go for it.
Okie dokie. Yeah, so that was the fast demo. I'm glad nothing broke, because my cluster runs on spot instances for cost saving reasons. And I was expecting that something is going to shut down, but everything is working. Okay, so how do I really cut the costs down? What's going on there? That's the purpose of this webinar, and we're cutting to the thing. So step number 1, use open source. In here, you can see the comparison of MongoDB orb and Percona distribution for MongoDB. If you are going to use MongoDB Community Edition, you're going to spend 0, but at the same time, you're not getting enough features. MongoDB is open core, so in the community version, there are no backups, no encryption, no sharding, no nothing. If you use MongoDB Enterprise or Atlas, you get a lot of features. It's extremely feature-rich technology, but at the same time, it costs a lot. You're going to spend hundreds, millions, whatever it is, and add there your cloud bill. For Percona, for MongoDB specifically, we have Percona server for MongoDB, which is part of Percona distribution for MongoDB. And it's also extremely feature rich. So what we do, we take MongoDB community, and on top of that, we add all the enterprise features that you might need. So advanced backups, LDAP, data at rest encryption, audit, and all the various security tooling, performance improvements, and so on. It's 100% compatible with MongoDB as we rely on MongoDB community. And actually, it's also interesting about LDAP. I don't know if anyone here into MongoDB, but recently they announced that they will not support LDAP anymore. It will be only available in Atlas for some reason, which is surprising to me. So starting from Mongo 8, I think they're deprecating it. But we still continue to support it because we know how enterprise customers value that one. Step number 1, use open source. Step number 2, play container tennis a bit. As I mentioned before, containers are all about efficiency. Containers are all about cutting the costs. So in here that you have 6 containers and you have 48 cores to schedule. So in the world of your cloud bill, you can cut costs mostly from 2 different directions. First one is compute, the second one is storage. So playing container Tetris is all about cutting costs on compute. Let's say you have 48 cores, and what you would see if you open up your cloud environment right now, most probably you would see that all of your machines are underutilized, and most of your machines are underutilized. So instead of 48 cores, you actually run 60 cores, and you pay for those cores. So what you can do is you can play a bit of a Tetris, and instead of running 60 cores, you can run exactly 48. It's the ideal scenario, obviously, but it is how the world works with containers. Instead of running many machines that are extremely underutilized, you can crunch them down into small amount of machines and package your containers tightly onto those. Or you can also use smaller machines. And here I have a GIF which explains how it all works. So Kubernetes comes with various autoscaling tools. Either it's vertical pod autoscaler, VPA, horizontal pod autoscaler, HPA, and cluster autoscaler. So a bunch of autoscalers. They are already there. They are in cloud native ecosystem. And what they do is they just analyze your footprint, analyze the load, and match it with your capacity and real instance utilization. And what they do then is they make sure that they game the utilization for you. So instead of running 2 nodes, as I start here from the very beginning, I can actually downsize my containers, then put them all onto 1 node, and then kill the node that I don't need anymore. Or I can shrink this node, depends on my desires, it's all configurable. So step number 2, optimize. And now we're to storage. So the second biggest piece of your cloud spend is storage. And the beauty of cloud native ecosystem is that it has variety of tools that allow you to use various types of storage. One of them, in public clouds, you can use local NVMe drives, which means that there are some machines in Amazon or in Google Cloud that come with super fast SSDs that are just built into this machine. And instead of running on very pricey, I need to turn them. But anyway, instead of running on very pricey EBS volumes, what you can do is you can run on very cheap NVMe machines. It will not work for everyone because you need to have really big databases and you need to have very intense workloads to utilize all the IOPS. But if you do that, using local storage can save you almost 10x of your cloud bill. So how do you save money with open source databases? So first one, use an open source database. No vendor lock-in. You would free yourself right away instead of paying for licenses, instead of waiting for the vendor to push you to make some weird decisions. Just don't use this vendor anymore. Use open source. The next step is optimize. So you can optimize your resources today and save 60% of your cloud bill if you just start embracing cloud native technologies. We showed you how you can optimize your storage. We showed you how you can optimize your compute. That should be enough for the first step. Then you can optimize it even more with Kubernetes and various automations. And the last one, but not least, keep it simple. We show you Percona Everest, which is an open source database as a service. It provides you the same user experience that you can get from a public cloud, but it is open source and it can run anywhere. So you don't have any vendor lock-in whatsoever. And it's backed up by best database expertise in the world by Percona and by the vast community. I think that's it.
So yeah, so let's get that last slide up there. And Carl, if you want to hit us with some questions, you want to put the reference slide up, Sergey? There you go.
So the first question we have is, how do you integrate Percona Postgres with LDAP?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure if this question is about operator or Percona distribution for Postgres, but for both of those, it should be quite easy to do. I see we've tried various approaches, but none of them ever connected. I would love to learn more. I'm very open to jumping into a call and discussing the problem and seeing where the solution can be. But how do you integrate? I need to learn more what's not working for you. But does it integrate? Oh, yes, it does.
Next question is, how do you determine the memory needs of Percona Mongo, where we would have 40 gigabytes allocated for memory, but the instance would keep crashing after 2 weeks of running in production?
How to determine it depends on your workloads, but as you say that the instance keeps crashing, I would assume that it is because you are running out of memory and you have out of memory killer jumping in. So I'd assume that you need to fine tune your white tiger cache. The way to do it, usually the rule of thumb is that you set it, I believe, at 50% of your total allocatable memory. And that should give you the safety net so that your database is not going to crash in the container. I'm not sure if I'm answering it because I don't have enough context, but that's what I would do first is tune your wired tiger cache. We have it documented in our Percona documentation, and that should help you. But again, it's the same person who asked the Postgres question, so I would love to talk to you more if you have time.
So another question we have are, so what are the biggest challenges for running databases in Kubernetes?
You usually have the biggest challenge that we see is mindset shift, because a lot of people, they just want to do lift and shift. So I'm running my databases on VMs. I want to run them in Kubernetes now. I would just do lift and shift. I take my database and I try to run it in Kubernetes as is. It doesn't work that way. That is a path to disaster, because you need to make sure that you understand how cloud native technologies work. You need to understand what are the new variables in this equation, and you need to adjust your applications and your databases. But once you do that, you can reap all the benefits right away. And obviously another challenge is the maturity of technologies and the knowledge gap, because even if you understand how operators work and you just declare what you want and you deploy the database and it runs, there can be still situations where you need a bit of a skill to troubleshoot and debug. Not like deep knowledge, but at least some basic understanding of Kubernetes. And that's what we are doing with Everest. We are trying to remove this from the equation completely, where you can click, deploy, run, and forget, but in your own environment. So first one, again, mindset. That's the biggest challenge. The second one is you still need some knowledge of how cloud native technologies work.
Then another question is, so how does running databases in containers and Kubernetes impact performance?
I would give the short answer, it does not. So in the best case scenario, your databases are going to perform as good as your hardware. So if you run your databases today on VMs on hardware X, then you would have the same performance if you run your databases in Kubernetes on the same hardware. There are definitely some networking overheads. There is a 1% overhead on running the database in container, but on a large scale, you will not notice the performance difference at all, if done right.
So the next one's a question from me. Have you seen any strategies that have really worked with kind of database and technical teams to convince their decision makers to follow the approaches that have been outlined during the webinar today? So for the people on the call who might want to take this information and try and get this implemented, what have you seen successfully get used to convince decision makers?
Okay. I think it usually starts with the best customers that we have are the ones who already have experience with running their workloads in Kubernetes, not databases, just applications. So as we saw before, 90% of the organizations, they already run Kubernetes or plan to adopt it. So if you have experience with Kubernetes, then moving your databases there is going to be extremely easy. And to convince somebody that this technology is better than the other, there are multiple variables again. First one is cost. If you move from VMs to Kubernetes, or if you move from your non-open source vendor to Kubernetes, you're going to save costs. That's the first conviction point that you need to put into the game. The second one is simplicity. And especially it works for the customers who have their own DBaaS or have some scripts that they developed before to run databases, or they have their own platforms and they're struggling with maintaining this all. So coming with a business case and explaining that, hey, we're going to actually remove all these things from our plate. We don't need to maintain it anymore. Someone else is going to do it and it works already. It's open source. That's the second piece, right? Yeah, so first one.
I've got one
go
to
ahead.
add. I've got one to add,
Oh.
and that would be going to organizations like Finos or CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and talking with your peers. So if you're having a hard time convincing your boss this is the way to go, again, look at the member list of companies that are working within these foundations to make things better, to innovate, collaborate, all those good things. So don't forget that that's what these organizations are for, right? They're for resources to help you figure these things out. And when you can't figure out the right path forward, maybe somebody that's a member can show you where they came from.
That phenomenal answer at the end, and a great plug for Finos at the end there. We are at the top of the hour. The LinkedIns for our two wonderful presenters, Lori and Sergey, are posted in the webinar chat. So encourage our attendees to please connect with them. And any Finos projects that you'd like to give a pitch for to engage with Percona team members?
Like I said, we're doing Finos CCC, the Common Cloud Controls, and then we're also really trying to get our toes wet in the AI readiness SIG. For sure, Finos is the way where we want to be, because compliance is not going away. It's only getting more intricate. Again, I suggest anybody just check out what Finos is doing and be a part of it, just like we are.
Excellent. And with that, a big thank you, a big virtual round of applause for our presenters. Thank you very much for taking the time, and thank you to all of our attendees for joining us today. And as a final reminder, this is a member benefit for our community. So if you are a member and also would like to present webinar in our open source and finance webinar series, please let us know and we'd be happy to work with you on it.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.